welcome to the Craft of Historical Fiction podcast, where each week we discuss a historical novel or a topic in historical fiction. If you're a historical fiction writer or a reader who loves historical fiction, we hope this podcast will provide some insights into the craft of researching and writing historical fiction. My name is Emmaline Bennett, and I'm a historical novelist. I write stories exploring themes of power, oppression, resistance, and social change from a socialist perspective.
Yeah, I guess I can go now. Hey, I'm Dale. I am not a historical novelist, so kind of interesting that I'm on here. I write SFF that I would say is heavily inspired by my research and what I would call my day job as a history Ph.D. student at NYU. When I'm not writing fiction, I'm supposed to be working on my dissertation, which is on radio, politics, and fascism in early 20th century China and Germany. My main areas of research interest are China and Germany, as you might guess, but I have an interest in a lot of other periods of history too, especially Roman history, Byzantium, the medieval world in general, and I think you'll see a lot of that come out in my writing if you want to give me a chance and try to read it.
Okay, cool. So this first episode, we're just going to talk about like what we write about, why we write about it. And then our first topic is going to be about how to write about oppressive systems in fiction, because both of us write about very oppressive systems in our fiction, and it's an important topic for us to think about with so much oppression in the world today. And there's a lot of questions about how best to write about it in a fictional work. So that's our episode for today. But first of all, let's talk about what we write about. So, I am currently working on a novel series which is set in antebellum Virginia, and it's about enslavers and their enslaved children. It's a family saga exploring a lot of different perspectives, including abolitionists, enslaved people, and enslavers, exploring the theme of how oppressive systems damage the human potential of both oppressor and the press. So very relevant to our topic today. Yeah, I'll then throw it over to Daniel. Do you want to talk about what you write about?
Yeah, sure. So what I'm writing is very different. My current project is an SFF, science fiction fantasy novel that I would describe as a blend of many of my favorite genre influences, including hard-boiled detective fiction, Lovecraftian horror, and of course the sort of vaunted tradition of the political dystopian novel. I don't know if it has a very particularly deep social commentary to offer, but I try very much to offer it. And we'll be talking a bit more about the project as it goes on, so I don't want to give away too much right now.
Yeah, and I just finished reading it, the very first draft. I'm the very first reader, so that was very exciting. And it was great. I would describe it as like a blend of a lot of different genres, like dystopian, thriller, sci-fi, mystery, and I would say it does have very deep political themes to it. It's all about what to do in the face of an oppressive system, whether you just passively comply or whether you try to stand up against it. And there's like revolution brewing in the background, and there's a romantic subplot with espionage sort of elements. And yeah, it's really cool. I think a lot of people will be interested to read it.
I think she's talking my work up too much, but I will also put in a good word for Emmeline's novel. I think it's a very interesting historical novel with a very epic scope. I really enjoy getting to follow her cast through all these books and all these like decades of their lives, and I think fundamentally it is a very tragic story about how living under an oppressive system in which you internalize the sort of ideology of the society ruins not only the lives of the people you exploit, but your own shot at happiness as well. So yeah, I mean, I don't think we'll say a bad word about each other's novels here, but I assure you, genuinely enjoy each other's work, and I think it's very good.
Wow, you're much better at talking about my novel than I am talking about my own novel. When I have
I
to
get that
talk
sense from
about
you
my
too.
own.
Don't worry. I think that there's always like a bit of how do I put it? Authors always feel a bit of shame when they're talking about their own work because you
Mhm,
don't want to sound like boastful about it or talk it up too much and then only for the
mhm.
reader to read it and be like, well, that wasn't in there at all. So I do actually think it's more useful to have somebody else tell the audience like what our books are about, like or the other person. I mean.
Yeah. I think so too. Yeah, well, anyways, let's get into our discussion um, about historical and speculative fiction, which are really very closely related genres. So I don't think it's that weird that you're a speculative fiction author and you're on this podcast. I think both are kind of about like writing different worlds from our own. But yeah, I guess my question is, why do you write speculative fiction?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question to start off with. First of all, it's because speculative fiction is largely what I grew up reading. So when I was a kid, I think like a lot of kids, I started off reading stuff like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter because those were like the movies that were very popular at the time. And I remember like the first time I watched the Lord of the Rings trilogy with my parents and my sister, it was kind of a revelation. It was, honestly, I think one of the best things I'd ever watched. So I picked up the book and I read it as a little kid, and I did find it a little dense and not quite as entertaining as the movies. But I remember I was actually very fascinated by the appendices. In particular, I think it's Appendix B in The Return of the King, which is this like long timeline of like everything that's happened in like the second and third ages in Middle Earth. And I just remember being very fascinated with like Tolkien's world building. And the story itself I thought was also great, but I guess it didn't seem quite as novel to me because I'd seen it through the movies already. And of course, like a lot of American kids, I kind of grew up with stuff like Star Wars. Like I think that speculative fiction, sci-fi fantasy is just very much like a part of like the cultural consciousness these days. You kind of have to work to avoid it. And I really don't know anyone who you can say like isn't familiar with at least some aspect of it. And it has very much influenced my tastes. I mean, I think I read like a eclectic range of stuff these days. I just finished reading the Big Nowhere, which I thought was spectacular. It's a like hard-boiled like neo noir detective fiction novel from James Elroy. But at the same time, I think at heart, I've always kind of been an SFF person. The other reason I would say is that, frankly, my day job is kind of as a historian, and I find it like I think that it would create like a sort of strange dynamic to make what I read about in my fiction too close to what I do research on. That, obviously, my research and my interest in history influences my writing very deeply, but at the same time, I think it's very strange. There's not enough of a sort of like protective barrier, should we say, between like what I do for work and what I do for fun if I were to write a historical fiction novel about 20th century China, which by the way, I think is a fascinating period, and there really should be more like good historical fiction in English about it, but I digress. And I also think more broadly that speculative fiction is like a genre that has a lot of radical potential. There is a lot of very bad speculative fiction out there that I think is like fundamentally like quite reactionary, and it's there's like interesting elements in it. But and I personally, for example, like love Lovecraft. But when Lovecraft writes speculative fiction, he's projecting his own opinions on the real world into that, and then his opinions were extremely blinkered and fearful of like, I mean, racist even by the standards of early 20th century America, which is saying something. The guy was like afraid and like angry at anybody who was not like a wasp, which is a very extreme dynamic. But I think that extreme fear and like revulsion at like the other like really permeates his work. But at the same time, you have great authors like Ursula Le Guin, who does like very spectacular stuff with speculative fiction that I think is like a very powerful source of social critique. I don't actually think my work is personally heavily inspired by Le Guin. I appreciate her as an author, but it's just not a style I write in. But I do appreciate the efforts of people to write like a sort of more thoughtful kind of speculative fiction. But at the same time, I don't dismiss the sort of like pulp or more problematic influences. I want to reshape them into something more interesting and more politically critical.
Yeah, that's great. So what's kind of your personal philosophy underlying your speculative fiction?
My personal philosophy is that I want to write about systems that are fundamentally not too different from the ones that we have today, which I think is going to be a black mark on me from some SFF people who really do like reading about alien societies. But I think that what SFF allows us to do is it allows us to sort of like heighten the tensions that are already in our current society. I think to myself that like one of my big influences is a sort of like dystopian fiction that came out of like 80s like Thatcherite Britain, where you have like a lot of authors who are writing things like Judge Dredd, or I think the original sort of like lore for Warhammer 40K comes out of that period. It's very punk inspired, and it's depicting this like bleak dystopian future society that's really just like an exaggerated version of what's going on in Britain at the time. It's gray and it's horrible, and there's this police state, and everything's being privatized and sold off to like an extreme scale, but it very much is just like a heightened version of what's actually happening in our social reality. And I think that creates like opportunities for them. It created an opportunity for humor, but I think it actually deepens the force of your social critique, that like you take these elements that are like very much present in the world today, and then you sort of like you exaggerate them. And I think every author who writes any form of literature will always exaggerate them. And in sci-fi, you can just kind of bring that up to a new level. The technologies they invent have actually deepened exploitation to a far greater degree than we have in our world today. But the tendencies are fundamentally the same.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to return to this question that you raised earlier of like why um why you write about speculative fiction rather than historical fiction, and you've talked before about like this like stigma that historians have against historical fiction. You want to talk more about that?
Oh no. So I think I'm being a little harsh there. I think there are plenty of historians who do read and enjoy historical fiction, but at the same time, like I found it pretty rare to find like a historian that also writes historical fiction on the side. And I think that's more what I'm trying to say. So one of the
Mm,
books I read recently was Arcady Martine's A Memory Called Empire, which I thought was spectacular. And Martine is like she's someone who has like a PhD in Byzantine history, and the society in her novel was obviously influenced by what she's studied in her PhD, but at the same time it's not supposed to be a direct representation of like historical reality. And fundamentally, I think like that kind of approach kind of I think it gives us some professional cover. We say that we're writing this fun stuff on the side. It doesn't reflect on our scholarship because possibly when you have a history PhD and you write a historical novel, people will sort of raise their eyebrows and be like, "Well, why did you write this instead of like I don't know, like publishing like another like scholarly book or something?" You get a lot less of that if you choose to write in an entirely different genre. And as I said, it's also just a matter of like, and I don't know if this is true of other historians who write fiction, but I suspect it is. I think it's just good to have a separation between your artistic career and your scholarly career to some degree. And I don't know. I think that when I think of someone like Tolkien, who is also an academic and a writer, I think fundamentally it's kind of fun and it's more fun for us to like do something that's entirely creative on our own instead of just trying to recreate what we read about in sources all day. And what we create on our own, like the sort of like the sub creation that that's the way Tolkien put it, or like world building is really it's really just like it's a different form of an intellectual exercise, and in some ways I think it's more rewarding than just like redoubling what we do in our work lives.
that makes sense. Yeah, I feel like it's a little unfair for historians to be so critical of historical fiction because historical fiction and history to me are very complementary. um, where like historical fiction kind of like fills in. It has the same sort of impetus behind it of history, of trying to understand the past and trying to understand how people lived in the past. And it's trying to fill the gaps of what traditional academic history can't do. Like I think of someone like I guess this is getting into the question of why I write historical fiction.
Yeah, I think this is
Um,
this is a good segue. You should take over now.
Yeah. So why I write historical fiction? I would say I write historical fiction because to me it's a way of better understanding our present world by understanding how that present world came into being. That's why history is so important. And of course, Daniel will agree with me being a history PhD student that history is important. History is how we understand the social forces that shaped our world and led it to be what it is. So, like, for instance, I write about American slavery, and that is so important for understanding how just this history of slavery in the Americas is so important to understanding how our world came to be the way it is, why inequality is the way that it is, why ideologies of racism remain so persistent. And like, you can't understand American history without understanding that history, which is why I write about it. Um, and yeah, I think that like historical fiction, it does things that history can't do. Like I think of someone like Saidiya Hartman who writes about has this methodology called critical fabulation, which is all about trying to fill in the gaps that the archives uh don't that the archives don't record, and trying to just like through a sort of like more fictional narration trying to sort of fill in those gaps and try to understand how people, especially if they were part of oppressed groups, oppressed and exploited groups, how they lived. And like to me, like the best historical fiction does that. It looks into the gaps that history can't can't recover fully. And it also just provides a different way of experiencing history. I mean, historical fiction can be so powerful because it really places you. Fiction has a sort of power that just like an academic text can't have, because it really places you in the shoes of another person. Um, and it activates just like a part of your brain that regular informational writing doesn't. It activates a very sort of instinctual part of our brain that's looking for simulation um, of real world experience. And we really crave fiction for that reason, because it's a way of kind of like understanding other people and understanding life without having to go out and experience life ourselves. And so historical fiction, it can be very powerful because it's activating that part of our brains, and it's doing so in a way that illuminates the lives of people living in the past in a way that ordinary history can't do. So I think historical fiction is very powerful, and that can be a power that can be abused, because there's been a lot of bad historical fiction that has actually, I mean, maybe this is why historical fiction can have a bad reputation among historians, because oftentimes historical fiction I think that historical fiction has a huge responsibility to be true to the historical record, but not every historical fiction author follows that. And there's a lot of historical fiction that distorts the past. I mean, one of my most hated books is Gone with the Wind, which has been a very powerful book in shaping the perception of the past. And so that shows the dangers of historical fiction as well. So it's very powerful, but that power can be used in negative ways as well. So yeah, but I write historical fiction because I think it can be very powerful to just bring the past to life in a way and help us to understand the world better by understanding the past.
Do you mind if I steer this conversation towards one of our next topics, which is that I think all fiction, regardless of whether it's set in the past or the future or another world, is fundamentally still very much about our present.
hmm And I think historical and speculative fiction are very much alike in that way, because they're both technically about other worlds besides our own, other times besides our own, but they're really about social issues that are affecting us today, at least if the writer is doing it properly, because that's what readers care about in the end. And it's
Oh, you
impossible
can
to.
you can still write about social issues that affect the present just from a very bad or reactionary perspective.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Like Lovecraft or like Margaret Mitchell.
hmm hmm
Yeah, so I guess that's a good segue into our topic for this episode, which is how to write about oppressive systems in fiction. And the first
Wait,
question
Emma,
that
do you want
I
to do your plug first?
Oh yeah, sure. Let's do our plugs, because you have a plug as well. So yeah, if our writing sounds interesting to you, dear listener, you can subscribe to my author newsletter for updates on my work. My series is currently still unpublished, but if you subscribe to my newsletter, you can get updates when it is published. And if you're really, really interested and you want to read it before it's published, you can get in touch with me if you're interested in beta reading my work. So I'll give you a copy in exchange for you telling me your reader response. And you can do both those things through my website, emmalineBennett.com, EMMALINEBENNETT.com.
All right, yeah, I guess I'll go now. So, I'm much newer to this. I don't have an author newsletter or a website, but if you want to contact me, you can do it through my email. I usually check my academic email these days, so you can email me at ds6304 at nyu.edu. If you prefer not to do it through my academic email, I also have daniel.shao.98 at gmail.com. Shao is spelled Shao. And yeah, I don't have a newsletter or anything, like I said, but if you are interested in beta reading my work, I'd be very happy to share it with you. Just keep in mind that this is still a second draft. I'll say this now. It's the first novel draft I've ever completed, and you should read it as if it's like a early rough form of what the final story is going to be. But I appreciate any feedback you could give me. Whether it be pros or whether you liked a character or hated them, or whether you thought the plot was just going nowhere for a while. let me know.
All right, cool. So, yeah, let's talk about this topic of how to write about oppressive systems in our fiction.
Mhm.
And I guess the first question, which I'll direct to you, Daniel, is why should we write about oppressive systems in our fiction?
Yeah, yeah, we've talked about this a bit already, but like
Mhm.
fundamentally, I think that we all live under deeply oppressive systems, right? And I think that like any human who's alive has probably done so. We all live in these highly stratified societies where like, so some of us, I suppose, like theoretically live in democracies, but there are ones where people with like the most wealth, like obviously have more political influence than people who don't. We have elections, but they increasingly start to feel like sort of like sham elections in which you have two options, which are fundamentally, I don't want to say the same, but one of them is, telling us that we're going to end the world now, and the other one's telling us that we'll manage the end of the world sensibly. And so it often feels like we're living in like I think that a lot of people will feel this way, that we're living in like a very bad time where the good times are over. The decline is starting. It's kind of like how like Tony Soprano starts off the Sopranos. He's like, oh, I missed the good part, and now it's all like downhill from here. But yeah, like so I think if you want to reflect just like a very important aspect of human experience and our present reality, you kind of have to write about systems that are oppressive and dysfunctional, because all of us really understand, I think, deep down in our hearts what it's like to live in a system like that. And it's, I think, a very like honest way of writing fiction. I mean, some people like more escapist stuff. I mean, I know a very popular genre of light novel these days is like when you get like set into this other world where like everyone loves you and thinks you're the best thing ever. I think that's fine for people who like that kind of thing. But fundamentally, I think it makes for more interesting fiction when you have tension and conflict and things are obviously going wrong.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that, like you said, I mean, we live in a society that is so filled with all of these oppressive systems, and I think it's really important to understand where those came from. And so like I'm thinking of it from a historical fiction perspective of like if we write about oppressive systems of the past, it helps us to gain an understanding of how the oppressive systems we live under today, how those systems came into being and how they evolved over time. And I think that's really important if you want to understand the human experience in history, which has been filled with deeply oppressive systems. But also, if you want to understand how to change the world, you have to understand how those systems came into being. You have to understand how oppressive systems work, how they function, the ideologies behind them, if you want to change them. Um, and so like I write about a society that is deeply racist and sexist um in my fiction because I want to figure out like why does racism exist so that we can combat it, and like why does sexism exist so that we can combat it. I think you can't understand how to change these systems unless you understand why they exist in the first place, and fiction can be a way of understanding, bringing an understanding to that question that's different from just examining it through a theoretical text or something like that. Fiction is a way of like really experiencing those systems up front the way that people experience them in history. It's a more immersive way of like understanding those systems and showing the effect on people's lives. It's more emotional than what you would get just from studying it in a more theoretical way.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. I mean, one of the issues I have when I'm actually doing academic history is that, a lot of it's like very like I think we intentionally will say that like we feel like it's kind of impossible for us to capture someone's lived experience, and to do so almost feels like it kind of crosses the boundaries of what we can do with scholarly methodology. So it's into that gap that I think literature can step in and you know, try to make its contribution.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we can move to our next question, which is how do we write sensitively about oppressive systems in our fiction? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. Okay. So sensitively, that's a very interesting question, because I think SFF in some ways has some advantages when it deals with this, because the violence and racism and misogyny that you see in SFF is, I think, always going to be a reflection of our experiences with those things in the real world, but it's fundamentally not depicting an event from the real world. And I think there's a certain sort of like moral weight that you bear when you're trying to depict experiences real people have gone through before that I would not say is absent, but I think is lessened when you're writing SFF. So that's kind of, I think, like one of the advantages, or I don't know, if advantages is the right word to use for it. But one of the things that we have, I think that makes our job a little easier than historical novelists. The thing I think that makes it harder is ironically also the same thing, that it's all fiction, often in like a constructed world, and that because that raises the charge that when you're depicting any instance of like violence or just any sort of like other horrifying act, that you're just doing it for the sake of titillation. Because like the argument is always, oh, you didn't like need to have a scene where like I don't know, like, a baby gets roasted alive, like that's just, you know, like you were the one who chose to put that in your world. You're the one who chose to create a world in which these kinds of things happen. So like, why did you do that? Are you just doing it because you just want readers to sort of be shocked by like the I don't know, like the sort of like lurid qualities of your work? Because that is certainly true of some SFF. I mean, a lot of it is just like almost fetishistic or like, pornographic in its like depiction of violence. And that is like a risk that you can definitely run into. Personal take on this is that I think that I think that this is kind of an obvious point, but the world building should serve the themes of the story. And if the themes of your story are fundamentally about how, you know, oppression is evil and it should be resisted, I think that does give you a leg up over someone who's just writing a story where, like, I don't know, a guy goes around murdering a bunch of other people with a cool sword because you want to show off how cool the sword is. Not that they're, hey, that, you know, if you like that, you know, well, props to you. But yeah, but just because you have good intentions, of course, things can also go wrong. I mean, I acknowledge that I think all authors have sort of shortcomings in their work. I try my best to avoid, you know, having any instance of, you know, violent or graphic content in my novel just like cross over into the territory of something that's blatantly just like just meant to be pure entertainment in a fetishistic way. But people's thresholds for that will differ. And, you know, if somebody says that, you know, they felt the level of like gore or violence in my book is like a little too much for them, I understand that. I mean, I think people have different tastes when it comes to these things. But yeah, I think when like the vast majority of people are telling you that something seems like very sus, as they say today, or just like, you know, like kind of meant to titillate rather than like actually inform people about like, the general like themes or advance the plot, that's when you're getting into dangerous territory.
Yeah, I think that a lot of that applies to historical fiction. And I think that's a great point that you raised about how there's this moral weight when writing about real life oppressive systems that occurred in history, which is what happens in historical fiction. Yeah, like absolutely. When writing about, say, my project, which is about American slavery, there's this huge moral weight to get it right. Um, and there's this tightrope act that you need to follow as an author where, like, on the one hand, you can't sanitize the system. You can't soften it out and represent it as less violent than it was, because then you're falsifying history. But on the other hand, you can't just descend into the level of like what they call trauma porn either, where it's like you're just writing about the historical trauma in like an exploitative or gratuitous way, where it just becomes about like characters being victimized. So it's kind of like, how do you strike the right balance where you're representing the history accurately and representing those past systems as oppressive as they truly were, while at the same time not veering into the gratuitous territory. I think that's really the line that historical fiction writers have to be careful to, you know, not tip into one extreme or the other. Um, and the way that I try to deal with this is like whenever I'm depicting violence in my story, I try not to describe it in like graphic detail. There's a lot of violence in my novel, but I try not to describe it in such great detail to the point where it becomes just exploitative. Instead, I try to focus on what are the characters' emotions as this violence is happening, and like what is the effect on my characters, like, and focusing on their interiority. So it's not just reducing them to uh the violence that's happening to them, but it's focusing on like what is going on in their minds as it's happening. That's one strategy. Another strategy is like, this is something that's really tough, is the question of agency, and like how do you give characters agency within an oppressive system that the whole purpose of that system is to deny their agency. And, I've gotten critiques on my first novel of like my protagonist being lacking agency because of the way that the system is like systematically stripping her of agency. And that's a really tough question to deal with as well in historical fiction is like, to what extent do you want to be accurate to the way that the system actually deprives people of agency versus like the need to give characters agency in the story as a way of empowering them? It's a hard balance to strike. I think that as much as you can show within the confines of the system some form of like resistance to the system is always going to be positive. And so like whatever ways your characters can resist, like show them doing that. And even if they're punished for it and even if it fails, it's still a form of resistance to the system and it's still giving that character agency. Yeah, so that's how I would say to write sensitively about oppressive systems.
Interesting that you bring up agency because I feel like a very common theme in both hard-boiled detective fiction and also Lovecraftian fiction is how little agency the protagonists have. And I actually think that's a very powerful thing in fiction, that sense of powerlessness that I think everyone feels at some point, that we're struggling against these people that and these systems that seem so powerful and all-encompassing. It feels like you are like a little bug that somebody can just stamp on at one point and, not even think about it, not even realize that you were there. And I think that is actually like something that I try to capture in my fiction. And I think that I don't do it to sort of amuse the reader or just like just for the sake of jump scare or shock value. I think it's a very powerful human emotion that I think many people have felt at some point, and it's worth trying to express.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Yeah, it's tough because so much of what makes a novel engaging is like having a character who has agency. And so it's kind of like you want your character to have agency, but like it's really tough when the system is actively denying them that. And so how do you strike that balance? I think it's a tough balance to strike. Yeah.
I feel like we're moving on to our next topic a bit now, which is
Yeah.
how to write about oppressive systems in a radical way.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so how do you write about oppressive systems in a radical way? The way I fundamentally approach this in my work is, of course, I think that there is something to the fact that oppressive systems, or I suppose that you could say capitalism in general, generates the contradictions and the tensions that ultimately undermine it. And I think you can even generalize this for systems beyond capitalism. I mean, there is a certain element of decay and inertia that sets into any sort of bureaucratic structure where once you have institution that was originally meant to serve a purpose and society changes around it, it still tries to carry on as if nothing has really changed and it becomes ineffectual or corrupt. I think that corruption, for example, is just a very sort of natural human thing under capitalism, right? Because there is the profit incentive, and when sort of formal structures of making your profits fail, you turn to less formal ones, especially if the reward is great enough. And one thing that I really want to emphasize, one thing I really like about hard-boiled detective fiction is that the police in most hard-boiled detective fiction is depicted as just as bad as the criminals that they're pursuing, if not worse. So, for example, I was just watching L.A. Confidential lately, and a big plot line in L.A. Confidential is that after the big mob boss for L.A. gets arrested, there's a bunch of people trying to like step in and fill the power vacuum because ultimately people still want drugs. And as long as that demand is there, there's going to be somebody to fill it. And who fills it? It turns out it's actually the police because they have the access to institutional authority and they can get rid of all the other criminals. They have access to better arms. They have access to institutional support. And so yeah, you have the main villain is this like corrupt police captain who like takes over the heroin trade. And is also extremely racist and views it as like sort of like a form of social control. Like his scheme is basically to like sell heroin to like black neighborhoods in an attempt to like keep them like docile, as he puts it. And I think like that is like one of those things where I think it really just emphasizes like the extent to which the official institutions that keep the law are supposed to keep the law and keep the orderly structures of capital accumulation in effect ultimately become subverted by that themselves. Like the police become the criminals. They become a dysfunctional organization that's more interested in like protecting their own and then taking over the illegal trade for themselves than actually enforcing like the laws that would ensure like long-term stability and success. And I think this is like something that you see in our society today. I mean, like just think of how much stuff in the US is, just like not functional or visibly crumbling despite like the supposed like great wealth that exists in our society. It's because so much of it has just been like systematically looted and intentionally destroyed to create profit for a few people. And Oh, in the short term, it's great for them. They have earned a lot of money from it, but in the long term, I don't think that this is like conducive to social stability. You live in a country where like most people are living in awful conditions and they don't have access to education and healthcare. Ultimately, that's not going to result in a very healthy economy or a very stable sort of regime that you can use to continue like defending like your property. And so, yeah, I think ultimately oppressive systems have a habit of subverting themselves.
Yeah, I love that point. It's very Marxist. Because Marx has this whole idea of like the capitalist systems and really any oppressive system contains the seeds of its own destruction. I really like that, and I think that in fiction you can dramatize that. You can show like how characters are resisting against oppressive systems and how those oppressive systems are not unassailable, that they are subject to being changed. And you can actually show that change in your fiction. I mean, there's so many examples throughout history of like oppressive systems collapsing. I mean, that's what really drew me to writing about the Civil War, is like that's like the biggest like social revolution in American history. In the 1850s, you have this incredibly powerful system of slavery. And like the slaveholder class is like at the height of its power. They're like trying to like expand into South America and like build an empire. They're, growing rich off of cotton. It seems like they're all powerful, and then it all sort of collapses because they just try to reach for too much power. So even at the height of slavery as a system, like there's all sorts of resistance going on. I mean, there are revolts. There are all sorts of forms of resistance besides revolts as well. There's people escaping. There's people engaging in maroonage. And there's this all sorts of resistance, and the system, even at the height of its power, is not immune to that resistance. And eventually it collapses and a completely different system takes its place. So I think that capturing that potential for social change in fiction can be a powerful way to send the message that the oppressive systems that exist in our lives today are also not unassailable. They're also subject to being resisted against and being changed. Yeah. And I would just add on to this question of like how to write about oppressive systems in a radical way. I think that from a more humanistic standpoint, I think a lot about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he writes about the dynamics of oppression and how oppression dehumanizes both the oppressor and the oppressed. Um, and I don't love that language of dehumanization because I mean people are always human. They can't be dehumanized. But I think if you think about it in terms of okay, what makes human beings uniquely human? It's like we have like potential for like so many things. We have potential for creativity, we have potential for cooperation, we have potential for empathy. And like oppression is what destroys all of those qualities. And so in that sense, it dehumanizes. And it dehumanizes not just the people who are oppressed, but also their oppressors, because the oppressors damage something within themselves by oppressing other people. And so I really try to kind of bring that truth to light in my fiction. I write from both the enslavers and the enslaved people's perspectives. And the reason I write about both is because I want to show, first of all, the impact of these oppressive systems on the people that they're oppressing. Um, and just like how it just totally tears apart lives and destroys the potential that could have been reached by so many people. But on the other hand, I also want to show like how the enslavers also damage themselves by enslaving other people, and like they destroy something human within themselves. And so I think that is a way to write about oppressive systems in a radical way. And I guess like we should define that term radical. Like, what is radical? And again, I think of Paulo Freire and his definition of radical as being about like transforming the world. So like to be radical is to want to transform the world. Um, and I think that that should be like how we think about being radical in our fiction, is like we want to write fiction that transforms the way that our readers see the world. so that they might go on in turn to change their lives and to change their way of thinking about the world, which also might change how they act within the world. Yeah, I would say that's how to write about oppressive systems in a radical way.
I was going to say one thing I really appreciate about your book is how insecure you show the positions of even these rich planter families to be, and that beyond their like sort of like exploitation of their own family members, they're also constantly in these they're getting themselves into these highly leveraged situations where they're like taking out huge amounts of debt to keep their operations going because if they don't do so, the whole thing will explode on. It's
Mhm.
not going to be sustainable if they're not constantly expanding. And I think that is like kind of that's kind of the thing about capital. Like it always seeks like constant expansion, even at like the expense of just like instability. And it constantly puts people who are subjected to its force, whether that be the average exploited worker or the capitalist, that they're constantly in this state of anxiety. For the worker, it's whether you can earn enough money to even like afford food the next day. For the capitalist, it's like can I still keep being a capitalist or am I going to lose my class position? Because, if I don't, try to extract every drop of value possible, then I'll be left out of this. I'll lose my position, and I'll have to join everyone below me.
Yeah, that was definitely something I was trying to get at with my novel series. I would say there's another theme in my novel series, which is like, this is especially true in the first book, which is that like the drive for profit really destroys human potential. And I wanted to show like how the drive for profit really controls everyone. It controls the people who are exploited, but it also controls the people who are part of the ruling class. And it forces them to act in certain ways, like again, taking out, like you were saying, like taking out huge amounts of debt. And it's a very precarious existence for them in a way because they're always struggling to maintain their class position. So, like in my first book, you really see this with like one of the enslavers, like experience a kind of financial downfall because of the workings of the capitalist system. So no one under capitalism is really secure. Everyone is kind of uh everyone is kind of equally controlled by the whims of capital.
It's this terrifying, inhuman force that nonetheless controls all of our lives. It's something we've built
Mhm.
ourselves, but has subjugated us along with it. So yeah, I'll just say that that's something I'm also trying to explore in my novel, but I will not clarify further because you will have to read to find out more.
Okay, well, do you have any other thoughts on this question of writing about oppressive systems?
I think fundamentally, I do agree with you that it's actually very interesting to see the system from the perspective of someone who ostensibly benefits from it, because oftentimes those people are, as you say, like quite miserable for various reasons. Despite the fact that they're supposedly on top and they have all this like power and authority, they're still not happy with where their lives are. And you might say that that's because they're not acknowledging the humanity of like other human beings, including their own children. And I think that's very true. But on the other hand, like I think that whatever power you have as like an individual capitalist is always going to be like very, very little compared to the sort of like internal logic of the system. That is like the force that you're still, subject to. And even if I don't know, you're like the president of the United States or like the richest man in the world, whatever capital dictates is something that you'll have to obey, or you'll find yourself further down the totem pole.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, do you wanna wrap up this discussion now and go to our call to action?
Yeah, I'm gonna paraphrase my favorite YouTuber here. Like and subscribe, all the things that make the being join. Rate it 5 stars on Amazon, Spotify, whatever. Tell all your friends and family to listen because obviously you were incredibly entertained. And it was the most enlightening thing you'd ever heard. So just spread it far and wide. Our podcast is the
Yeah, and I'll just add to that that there's a newsletter as well for the craft of historical fiction, which you can access at emmalineBennett.substack.com. So yeah, thanks everyone for listening. I hope it was fun.